Join me on an inspiring journey through the world of fitness, health, and performance with the Genetic Coach, where I delve deep into the genetic foundations of athletic endurance, discovering how genetics is revolutionizing our understanding of human potential and how we can unlock our full athletic capabilities through a fresh perspective on conventional practices. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Genetic Coach, the podcast where we explore the science of personalized performance, one genetic insight at a time. I'm Di White, and today we're diving into a topic that really doesn't get much attention in athletic circles. And we're going to be talking about hormones and injury risk. Now, currently there is a lot of conversation around hormones and how they impact the female athlete in particular from a menstrual cycle point of view. But what about how these same hormones influence muscle and tendon strength, connective tissue elasticity, soft tissue and bone resilience? And not only in the female athlete, but the male athlete too. So today we're looking at how the body's steroid hormones influence everything from collagen and muscle repair to stress resilience and inflammation. And more importantly, we'll talk about how genetics can give you the inside scoop on your hormonal tendencies. And I'm pleased to be joined today by one of 3x4 genetics experts, Marina Shanafelt. And she is a certified nutrition specialist with a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. She brings over 5 years of private practice experience, specializing in personalized nutrition for health optimization and chronic disease reversal. And for the past 3.5 years, she has served as a nutrigenomics mentor at 3x4 Genetics, supporting clinicians in applying genetic insights to client and athlete care. So welcome, Marina.
Hi, thanks, Di. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm really excited to dive into this topic today because I think even in our conversation when we were discussing topics that we were looking at including, it was something that not even I had really had much of a handle on and spoken about much. And thanks to you, you brought it to the fore and said, hey, what about this? Why don't we talk about this? So thanks so much for that. And let's get into it straight away. So maybe we can start off by talking about the key hormone players. What are steroid hormones and what role do they play in the body?
Exactly like you said, we talk about these hormones primarily from kind of like a sexual reproductive characteristics perspective, and they really don't get that attention in terms of performance and recovery and things like that. So, yeah, definitely excited to jump in. But yeah, our hormones, we make them from steroids, so super important. And primarily we talk about the female hormones. We think of those as estrogen and progesterone, and we say they're female hormones because primarily, again, we think of them in terms of their role in the development of female reproductive systems. But it's important to know they also play a role in men's health as well. So yes, of course, women produce more estrogen and progesterone, and they play a role in menstrual cycles and fertility. But it's also really important in men, and especially when we have these conversations around tissue health, bone health, and recovery, they actually play a significant role in men, and we see that play out in sports the more and more that we research this. So estrogen and progesterone, they are primarily produced significantly more during the reproductive years from the ovaries, but in men, in testes and other tissues like the skin and in like fat tissue as well. And of course, these levels also fluctuate throughout our reproductive years. So it's interesting to see that play out in the things that we're going to talk about. We also talk about testosterone. Again, primarily we think of this as the male sex hormone, but again, women also produce testosterone, and it's actually the precursor to our estrogens. So important there. And the other hormones that we'll also be talking about are DHEA. So some people might have heard about that. It kind of talked a lot around in like longevity circles and things like that, but actually there's a lot of conflicting evidence around how DHEA actually plays a role in longevity, but we do know that it does play a significant role in hormone metabolism because it is a precursor for our estrogens and androgens, and it impacts hormone signaling, impacts bone density, energy levels, brain health, and influences cortisol production as well. So yes, that brings us to our last hormone that we'll probably be discussing at length today, which is cortisol. So we think of that as the fight or flight hormone, and it's primarily produced in the adrenal glands. And it's released by the HPA axis. So again, just think of it as kind of like the stress response hormone, but it regulates metabolism, influences mood and memory, and even plays a role in our sleep and wake cycles, our circadian rhythms. It also reduces inflammation, among lots of other functions. And high cortisol is often caused by chronic stress and can actually decrease estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone levels. So you can kind of already see the picture of how all these hormones start to play a role together that we'll dive into.
Brilliant. So, I mean, just looking at the research and from what you're saying, it's obviously really important that all these hormones remain in balance, because if there is some kind of imbalance, it's going to have repercussions in various different aspects of our health. And when we're looking at an athlete in terms of our performance as well. And we know that estrogen helps maintain connective tissue elasticity. Testosterone fuels muscle and tendon strength. We know that, as you said, cortisol helps us respond to stress, but in excess, it can weaken tissue and slow down repair. So it definitely is all about the balance. And we know that when hormones shift due to different life stages, and even due to different training loads and different types of stresses in life, your injury risk can change dramatically. So let's talk about now different life stages that we go through and how these hormonal shifts, what type of hormonal shifts we go through, sort of like, through puberty and going into perimenopause or menopause, and how does that all impact somebody's injury resilience as they move through these stages?
So, we definitely see a significant rise in our sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, as we enter puberty and kind of go through those peak fertility stages, in our 20s and 30s. So this is really the time when you have the most of these hormones and typically kind of the best ability to build muscle, promote better bone density, respond really well to training and exercise. But that fluctuation can also influence some vulnerabilities. We can kind of talk about some specifics with that, with connective tissue and this increased vulnerability actually that we see with increased ACL rupture, specifically in women who are menstruating. And then we even see these shifts happen as we start to look at oral contraceptive use. Some risk goes down, other risk goes up. So it really can get quite complicated. And we can kind of dive into that one by one and see. And then, as women get into perimenopause and menopause, the estrogen, the progesterone, testosterone all starts to decline. It's not all bad. You actually see some protective effects here, but of course, we have to mitigate the vulnerabilities around that bone density, and poor, faster muscle loss, poor anabolic capacity of the muscle that we see. And so then we have that hormone replacement therapy conversation. What do we need to be aware of? How do we do that safely? And what's, potentially, a better approach and things to think about. And similarly in men, you see the same rise in testosterone during, puberty, and into those main fertility years. And then that drops off towards, unfortunately, it happens pretty early, like 30s is like your peak, and then it's all downhill from there.
Oh, goodness.
But but similarly, kind of considering, well, where are our vulnerabilities within these different stages of life? So again, it's not all good or bad. I think we sometimes try to put everything in a box, like more testosterone is good, but actually it can inhibit certain processes too. So it's just kind of knowing where you are in life and how do we mitigate risk and optimize, the best capacity that we have in that time frame.
Mm. Okay, so let's dive into the puberty side of things. You mentioned increased ACL injury risk, particularly in females during puberty, and that high rise in estrogen. What can you tell us more about that? Because that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's actually something I started researching a while ago and kind of stumbled upon this whole estrogen relationship too. So it was actually quite new to me at some point as well. But it's really interesting because, we think of collagen as the main structural protein. It gives integrity to our skin, our bone, our connective tissues. And so it gives structure to our tendons and ligaments. And you might have, seen collagen supplementation out on the market.
Yes.
Very a common thing that we talk about in the world of sports and even just general maintenance. Collagen really supports the mechanical properties of these tissues. It gives us stability and strength. Now, estrogen directly affects the structure and the function of soft tissue, such as that muscle, tendon, and ligaments, and it increases the collagen content while also impacting its stability. So it does, multiple different things. And we actually see estrogen receptors that are present in all musculoskeletal tissue. So this really highlights the important role that estrogen plays in the regulation of these tissues, and specifically accounts for the differences that we see in injury type and propensity among men and women throughout, different life cycles.
Mm.
So like we mentioned, ACL ruptures occur up to 8 times more often in female athletes compared to their male counterparts. That's huge. And we see this
Wow.
especially in soccer. Yes.
Mm.
And you can imagine all that twisty movement is
Yeah.
not great if you have that vulnerability. But it's like, why do we see these significant differences among men and women? And so ligaments, which connect your bone to bone and they help to provide stability to the joints, we really want this type of tissue to be more stiff because it's going to provide more stability. While ligament laxity is going to kind of contribute to more vulnerability and potential for rupture of this tissue. And
Mm.
estrogen has actually been shown to increase that ligament laxity,
Mm.
making it more vulnerable to rupture, especially in the ACL. It was just one of those. We happen to study it a lot, so there's a lot that's known about the ACL, but it's any ligament, um, and we see this especially during actually the ovulation stage of your menstrual cycle, where that estrogen significantly goes up. And you actually see, and they've done tests on this, that ACL ruptures are much more common during that cycle period as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we're going to get to remedies later on, so I don't want to get into that too much now. But I mean, we've definitely seen from a training perspective how you can work with a female athlete's reproductive or menstrual cycle, to really understand when to push hard, when to pull back a little bit in terms of intensity and duration of workouts. What type of fueling needs there are in different stages of the menstrual cycle. So you're clearly saying the same thing from this research, that we can, understand at different stages in the menstrual cycle that there are higher and lower injury risks, and we should be taking that into account when programming for, female athletes in particular at different stages in their cycle. Is that what you're saying?
Something to be aware of. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that we would want to influence hormone levels specifically, in regards to that, because there's a lot of downstream effects from that. Unfortunately, you do see it a bit in sports. And I think it's just also important to understand, what are we impacting? So, for example, when we talk about, this ligament laxity, it is found that females on oral contraception, which, is going to have kind of like a more moderate level of estrogen and higher progesterone, they see about 20% reduction in oral contraceptive users with the ACL ruptures, but they actually have a much significantly increased risk of tendon and muscle injury. So again, it's not black and white. It's not so clear. So to your point, it's like we just need to understand our athletes and see where are your vulnerabilities. What does the sport require? And how do we mitigate, that unnecessary stress during certain parts of the cycle, and make life choices that are optimal for our overall health as well as our training.
Mm.
So of course, estrogen is going to have a lot of benefit, and we'll really get into that momentarily here as well. But to your point, we can look at load, we can look at the way that we train, and mitigate risk.
Mm. Okay, so we've spoken a lot about the female. What about the male in puberty? How does that impact with testosterone, and what impact is that having on injury risk for the male?
Kind of simplify men and their testosterone picture a little bit. It's a little less complicated than women, and all the different hormone fluctuations that we have going on. And so in men, typically you do see increased muscle mass, increased bone density, and that sort of thing. But when we actually have this conversation around the soft tissue and connective tissue, and we kind of switch our focus over to the tendons, the story changes a bit here. And so with tendons, the goal of a tendon is different than the goal of a ligament, where a tendon connects the bone to a muscle. And so you actually want a little bit of flexibility there because it's going to reduce this kind of like stretching that could happen to the muscle, with over kind of compensation of movement there. And so, where estrogen kind of creates this vulnerability around ligament laxity, it's actually protective to the tendons. And so, you see actually less strain, less muscle strain in women and more muscle strain in men. And that's due to that lower estrogen and elevated testosterone levels that we typically see.
Mm.
Um, yeah. So again, just kind of depending on different life cycles, what kinds of things we want to be aware of. So, for example, in professional soccer, women actually experience 54% fewer muscle strains, as well as lower frequency of groin and hamstring pulls and Achilles tendon ruptures as compared to men. However, after menopause, these kind of became pretty equal among men and
Mm.
women. So again, you kind of see these fluctuations depending on where you're at, um, in your life stage. And yeah, and also the other thing that's really interesting, again, kind of going back to oral contraceptive use, what effect does that have? Well, yes, maybe it might be supportive in ligaments, but in tendons, um, we actually see that this contributes to increased Achilles tendinopathy, increased muscle damage, and even promotes more delayed onset muscle soreness or DOMS too. So it's shown that this rise in estrogen that's seen in the regular menstrual cycle is actually beneficial and decreases the injury risk in respect to tendons and muscle injury.
It's a really complicated picture.
Yes.
As you say, there is no black and white, and this is better or this is worse. It really, there are so many factors that, and we know that injury is so multifactorial. And
Yes.
it's no one thing that you can put your finger on and say that's due to this, but it really is helpful to understand. The complex nature of injury predisposition, to really help us mitigate it. But before we move on, there's something else I'd like to chat about, and that's the issue of low energy availability, and the reds in female athletes when energy intake is not matching energy output. And definitely how that impacts hormone production, and thereby increasing injury risk. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought this up because it's such an important conversation to have. Because unfortunately, it really is a major problem in the world of women's sports, but you also see it in men's sports as well. So,
Mm.
I think it's really important to kind of bring this to the forefront. So, yes, like you mentioned, chronic energy deficiency actually can lead to high cortisol production. So remember, that's that stress response. And then that cortisol production coupled with a low energy state actually inhibits our steroid hormone production. So you ultimately end up with typically low estrogen levels, low testosterone levels, or at least an imbalance between the two. But over time, you typically just kind of tank your hormone levels. And then on top of that, it's not just about the hormones, but it's about that energy availability, right? Because if we're competing and exercising at such a high level, you have such a higher energy requirement and a higher nutrient requirement. So it's not just about calories, it's also about that nutrition component. Can we make the different things that we need to make? Can we repair our tissues? And all of that is really significantly impacted when we have this energy deficiency. So one thing, when we have that hormone balance, but it's another one that's coupled with that low caloric intake, accompanied by that low nutrient status. So things that we just kind of discussed with the vulnerabilities around tissue health, muscle damage, and even specifically bone density concerns with lower estrogen and testosterone levels is going to be exacerbated significantly and driven by this chronic energy imbalance. That really is going to put athlete at significant injury risk for all tissue damage. And further, it's going to really reduce adaptation and recovery and contribute to increased inflammatory mediators that we see that's going to reduce that recovery over time and ultimately put our athletes at a significantly increased risk for injury. Um,
And how
yeah,
long
so we can really do. Mhm.
Sorry to interrupt you there. I'm jumping in, but once an athlete is in this energy deficient sort of phase, how and if they are sort of counseled out of it and working with nutrition specialists and whatnot, they start understanding how to really fuel their body well. How long does that injury predisposition last for, having had the energy deficit? Does it sort of rectify itself as soon as you get onto a good nutritional regime or program again?
Takes time. Hormone balance is really a tricky thing as we kind of see, there's a lot of factors that play a role. So it does take time to balance that out from a nutritional standpoint, energy standpoint. And we can definitely improve the outcomes. It's going to take time. And the reality is we do long-term damage as well. So you do see kind of longer recovery time and tissue health decline over time. And especially we see it in bone mass density much later in life. So even these kind of short bursts of energy deficit that specifically impacts hormone imbalance, it does have some long-term effects. But the good news is that we can, for the most part, turn it around. But we do want to be careful not to kind of promote that process.
Mm. Okay, and then you mentioned something about DHEA being the longevity hormone, and I know there is a lot of talk about it in the industry. What is its role, and how does that contribute to injury risk?
So, DHEA is important because it is a steroid hormone precursor as well. So, it promotes our estrogen and testosterone production, but we need to be careful with it too because it can also, depending on some genetic vulnerabilities, can produce more of a cortisol production in some people. And you actually then see that impacting their overall estrogen and testosterone levels. So DHEA is just another hormone. It is going to play a role in our tissue health, and it is one of those that we see it declining with age and kind of plays into this overall tissue health decline over time. Um, yeah.
Okay. So we need to start talking about the genetics because this is where it really starts getting interesting. And, we can do genetic testing to reveal predispositions, but what genes are we looking at and how do we use the genetic information to start making decisions?
Genetics really can help highlight kind of where our vulnerabilities are. So, yes, there's certain environmental factors like a low energy state, high stress that could potentially influence hormone imbalance. But the vulnerability, each individual's vulnerability to how they will actually respond to that environment is going to be different. Are they more vulnerable in soft tissue damage or bone damage or inflammation or oxidative stress that's going to impact their recovery? It's really going to be specific to each person. So we look at a lot of different genes. This is where it's really helpful to actually work with a clinician who's going to be able to put the whole picture together for you. Because as you can see, even just from our conversation, it's quite complicated. So I can't say it's it's these three genes or anything like that. But when we see these groupings of genes in hormone balance enzymes, so in genes that code for enzymes that influence hormone metabolism, the production of hormones, as well as the detoxification of hormones. The way that these genes, such as estrogen receptors and your sex hormone binding globulin, can influence hormone signaling is going to ultimately impact their downstream, regulatory tissue. And so you see where some people might have more kind of vulnerability in their bone, more vulnerability in their soft tissue and connective tissue. And I think the important thing with hormone balance that I don't think we talk about enough is that it's almost never just about the hormone balance. The
Mm.
hormone balance or the imbalance in hormones is a symptom of a bigger problem upstream. So when we kind of run into hormone imbalance, we have to see what is contributing to this, what is causing this. And that's really where the genetics can play a huge role to help us uncover, is it factors of stress or histamine, which we haven't really talked about, but I have a pretty interesting case study that we can get into around that in a moment here. But it can kind of help us uncover what are the root causes of that hormone imbalance, where are vulnerabilities, and how do we best address both of those aspects.
Mm. So yeah, I think a reoccurring theme in all of our podcasts is it's all about context and understanding the patient that's sitting in front of you. And it's, yeah, as you say, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, these hormones do this, this, and this, and this. But if you really want to make it practical and, real world implications to our listeners. So, like you said, you have brought some case studies to run through, and that's going to be really eye-opening as to seeing how this actually plays out in the real world. So, what do you want to start with first?
Sure. We can start with we have a 21-year-old professional male hockey player. So, we talk a lot about women, but again, I don't want to overlook the role that hormones, especially your estrogens, even play with men as well. And, we talked a lot about stress, and this is a really good case where we saw that play out really directly for this hockey player. So, he was a 21-year-old hockey player, just kind of starting his professional career. And he was actually found to have low testosterone and low estradiol. So it's, our main kind of estrogen at that younger phase of life. So we're just going to group them together and call them estrogens. And that's kind of what we've been doing this whole time. But specifically, for any of our nerds there, it is estradiol that we're talking about. And so he actually, by the time he came to see us, he had just returned from a bone injury. He did have a fracture, and that ended his first professional season. So, he was really looking at recovery. He was looking at mitigating future injury risk. And it was very interesting because when we looked at his genetics, it really all pointed to this perfect storm that kind of, came to be in his first game. So what we saw in the genetics was that really significantly increased vulnerability to stress impacting his testosterone and his estrogen levels. So we look at genes in CYP19A1 and CYP17A1, and these genes play a role in hormone metabolism. So they play a role also in our response to stress. So these are people who might be more vulnerable to more cortisol production, and that can also then lower that testosterone and consequently estrogen levels that we kind of talked about earlier. So he had gene variants in these genes, again, that increased vulnerability to stress, driving that hormone imbalance. But then on top of that, he also had impact in a gene called SHBG, which codes for sex hormone binding globulin. So it's just a protein that kind of binds up our hormones, and particularly, for men, it can bind up more testosterone. Women as well, of course, but it's associated with this, his particular gene variant he had is associated with this increased testosterone binding. So he already kind of had low free testosterone, and that genetic predisposition contributed to that elevated sex hormone binding globulin, binding up that testosterone for him. And to take it a little bit further, he also had impairment in estrogen receptors called ESR2, meaning that low estrogen levels that we saw were going to impact estrogen signaling for him as well. So really kind of created this perfect storm of that hormone imbalance really playing a big role in his vulnerability.
Can I stop you there?
Yes.
I'll just ask you, so you spoke about his vulnerability to stress. Now, would that be considered more sort of life stress, or is that stress from his training, or is it a combination?
That's a great question, right? We talk about stress so much. So it's like, what does stress actually mean?
Mm.
It could be any of those things and all of those things. So, a certain amount of stress is good for our bodies. We know that we need a stressor to, improve bone and muscle tissue. But if it becomes chronic, that can be a problem. So whether it's overtraining or if it's life stress, like from, relationships or poor sleep or financial issues,
Mm.
any kind of chronic stress over time can really produce this chronic cortisol increase that we see, and that can then contribute to hormonal imbalance. So, of course, when we're working with professional athletes, yes, they're training hard and they're training very consistently. So, a lot of it is really talking about how do we support those processes and
Mm.
not necessarily eliminating the stress itself, because that, isn't necessarily feasible or supportive.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Continue.
Yeah, yes, great question. Um, and so actually to your point on that piece with the stress, he actually also had a gene variant in the wrinkle gene, which specifically for men plays a role in kind of this vulnerability with increased bone resorption, therefore reduced bone mineral density. And you see it especially under low testosterone levels and high mechanical load. So he had this increased vulnerability where this low testosterone was going to produce more vulnerability around that bone resorption for him. We also look at other impacts in his bone health pathway, specifically vitamin D signaling. So he had impaired vitamin D signaling; those are VDR, vitamin D receptor genes that we look at, and kind of vulnerability around his thyroid functioning, which is going to regulate all sorts of processes, metabolic processes, but also bone health as well. And so this really kind of also uncovered um, avenues for us to really influence his training and his overall health outcome. So,
Mm.
yes, the training likely exacerbated these vulnerabilities, but it also provided insight for us of, well, what can we do about it? So, the stress piece is huge. He also is somebody who really required a higher level of vitamin D in his blood, and it was just one of those that wasn't really being checked, and it wasn't something that he was supplementing. So you kind of see this increased vulnerability there. The other kind of interesting thing, he also had this impact in collagen synthesis and turnover. Those are we call it the COL12A1 gene and MMP1, a matrix metalloproteinase enzyme. And so that kind of low estrogen level that we see, again, we don't really test estrogen, estradiol, even LH, luteinizing hormone. We don't talk about that too much here, but all
Mm.
of these kind of typically like female hormones that we think about actually play a lot of protective roles for men as well. And so the big thing also to stress is when we talk about stress and cortisol, it really promotes an inflammatory process, and estrogen is very protective in inflammation. So when you have this low estrogen, you don't have that protective effect of estrogen. And that is relevant to tissue health, muscle health, like we talked about earlier,
Mm.
as well as the soft tissue.
Mm. So, so interesting. So I think the big question is, well, what interventions did you recommend and how did it work out?
Yes, of course. So we're still working with this player, but the main thing, the first things that we want to do is really normalize his nutritional intake. So low vitamin D was huge for him. He probably was also not fueling enough. And because we talked about that impact of that low estrogen contributing to kind of increased inflammation and increased oxidative stress of the tissue, think about that in terms of poor recovery and adaptation as well. So now we look at how do we mitigate the impacts of that, of inflammation and oxidative stress or tissue damage. So really, we look at a lot of cruciferous vegetables or brassica vegetables. Sometimes people think about them, those sulfur-containing foods, including like your allium foods, so garlic and onion as well, that really help promote better response to adaptation and kind of like lower inflammation of the tissues, as well as promote good hormone balance as well. So those high fiber cruciferous foods really help promote hormone balance and proper detoxification of our hormones as well.
Mm.
Um, Collagen support, of course, is very important. Making sure we have good vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, mineral balance. So, we can put him on quite a few supplements, really look at his diet. He was somebody who's kind of having like, standard American diet, so very inflammatory type foods, lots of processed foods. So that always kind of makes it a little bit easier for our job. It's, there are a lot of things that we can recommend there.
Yeah.
But also managing his training load as well in this recovery period, because he had these genes that are going to be more inflammatory, and really making sure that he heals thoroughly and properly, and that we don't overtrain in this scenario.
We've spoken about that many times before on the podcast as well, that it's often, when people are battling maybe with performance outcomes, or maybe just not performing as they expect to from their training, that often it's a recovery problem instead of an actual training problem. And I think you've highlighted that again, that the recovery side of things and understanding what is driving our recovery is so important for any type of athlete, regardless if you're coming from a professional context, or whether you're somebody who's an amateur athlete competing for their own, enjoyment. So yeah, really, really important. Okay, so have you got any feedback from him as to how the interventions have made a difference, or is it still too early for that?
Well, he's back out on the ice and he's playing, so far so good.
Okay.
Hopefully he'll continue on with the process.
Okay, brilliant. All right, so I think you mentioned you had a second case study, I think a female one. So maybe we can walk through that.
Yes. So our second case study is a 17-year-old dancer, and she actually just entered an international dance academy. So congratulations to her. Yeah. But she is one that actually experienced late onset of menstruation, likely due to the high stress from her, dancing load, as well as an inappropriate caloric intake that we talked about earlier. So she actually didn't have her first cycle until the age of 16. So you can really see that delayed, kind of puberty and the related hormonal imbalance that can happen from that. But now at 16, only a year ago, when she began menstruating, she actually had a lot of symptoms with this that impacted her ability to dance and to be active. So she was experiencing a lot of heavy bleeding, cramping, bloating, and pretty significant weight gain. And interestingly, we saw this in her genetics. And so this is kind of, we can bring in this idea of histamine overload. So we haven't talked about that yet, but it's something that we see a lot in our professional athletes. I mean, we see it in the general population, but we're talking about athletes now. We do see it quite a bit in athletes. And so histamine itself, it's an inflammatory mediator. It's released in mast cells in response to allergies or injuries. So sometimes you might think of histamine as related to itchy eyes, runny nose, that type of thing, as a response to things like pollen in the environment. But actually histamine plays a lot of roles. It's also a neurotransmitter, so it can also impact things like sleep, anxiety, and headaches. And it can even impact infertility. But it plays a really intimate role with our estrogen levels, which is why we talk about it a lot. So think about histamine as impacting inflammation, as well as impacting our estrogen levels. So we make histamine as part of an inflammatory process, but it's also found in the environment and foods such as aged meats and cheeses, leftover foods, canned foods, and even foods like egg whites and spinach are a little bit higher in histamine. So when we look at what we call the histamine overload pathway in the genetic report, it's looking at our ability to degrade histamine. So it's genes that code for enzymes that degrade this histamine. And this is important in terms of kind of someone's vulnerability to histamine impacting inflammation, as well as, like we mentioned, this connection with histamine and estrogen. So as estrogen goes up, it actually inhibits enzymes that degrade histamine, therefore kind of creating more vulnerability for this inflammatory process to persist. And in turn, that elevated histamine impacts estrogen levels. So we really often see this vicious cycle of histamine impacting estrogen and estrogen increasing histamine levels. And so really becomes a chicken and egg situation.
Mm.
So yeah, so for our dancer here, her estrogen, shot up pretty quickly. And she probably already had some kind of histamine problems. It just wasn't so apparent. And that estrogen really kind of set a fire under that histamine overload pathway.
Mm.
And so that, really significantly contributed to the inflammation that we saw, and impacted her ability to clear hormones, and contributed to a lot of the symptoms that she had, especially from a gut health perspective. So histamine itself can impact gut health. And, we saw she's another one of those CYP19A and 17A carriers where that stress is really going to push towards that more inflammatory cortisol stress pathway.
Mm.
And so we did see the impact of that. Um, because she had that delayed menstruation onset. We know that there was a hormone imbalance, likely, like we said, caused by a contribution of both stress and poor caloric intake.
Mm.
But what we also saw with her was other impact in her ability to detoxify those hormones too. So genes in our detoxification of hormones pathway that we look at, things like MTHFR, NQO1, GSTM, and MNSOD. These are all genes involved in hormone detoxification. When you have that really high estrogen and poor detoxification, it can cause a lot of imbalance, both kind of systemically, inflammation, as well as in the gut. And for her, it really manifested as she was really struggling with constipation.
Mm.
Um, so, luckily she was able to get support and intervention right off the bat as all of this was happening. So, really looking at her diet, managing histamine load, and there's a lot that we can do with that. There's foods that actually help to degrade histamine. So, looking at, of course, managing stress, improving the nutritional environment, nutritional intake, making sure that she's consuming enough calories, as well as lots of anti-inflammatory and antioxidant-rich foods to help manage the inflammation, as well as foods that are going to help support that proper estrogen metabolism.
Mm.
So a lot of times, young girls get put on hormone therapy, oral contraceptives because of their periods. And as we saw earlier, well, yes, maybe there's some benefit to that, but it's also really tricky. And maybe we don't want to go down that road because it also can cause a lot of downstream effects.
Yeah.
A lot that we can do with diet. So she was one that was actually able to normalize all of this primarily with diet and supplementation. So those cruciferous vegetables help support proper detoxification of our hormones, particularly estrogen. So she was really able to get kind of her PMS symptoms under control, and continue dancing. And now we see that she's dancing internationally. So she's doing quite well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So it really has translated. And I mean,
Yes.
you could potentially say, well, these things that you're recommending in terms of sort of nutritional interventions are kind of things that we know about. It's nothing new or particularly amazing in terms of what the recommendation is. But I think it's about understanding how we apply the recommendation in a specific person's context, and how we pick and choose the recommendation that come together to create this recipe for somebody that's going to speak very specifically to their genetics. So how would you answer someone who would come to you and say, "Oh, I don't need to have my genetics tested because, I mean, I know all these things and I can just implement them all and I'll be fine." What would your response be to that?
Well, first of all, I'd ask, are you actually implementing all of these things that you know you should be doing? And typically the answer is no.
Exactly.
Yes. But what the genetics really highlights is the why. So, yes, we know we should be doing X, Y, and Z, but let's pick one or two or three things that are going to have the greatest benefit.
Mm.
And so, it really helps us understand the genetic contribution, the genetic vulnerability, so that we can really tailor recommendations so that we don't have to do 100 different things that we know we're supposed to do. but just choose the 2 or 3 most important things that we can do is going to have kind of the greatest, return on investment. And the reality actually is that what might be good for somebody is not going to be good for somebody else. So there's lots of causes and contributions to things like estrogen and testosterone imbalance. And we talked, just kind of briefly about the genes, but certain nutrients can up or down regulate these genes. And if we don't know what our kind of baseline function of those are, we can do a lot of damage in the long term.
Mm,
And histamine is actually a really great example of this. Is that's one that I don't think we really think about
mm,
in the context of sport or health in general, but it's one that comes up a lot and it impacts everybody differently. So we have to understand what is the impact, and that comes from knowing the genetics. So it's like, yes, we could do trial and error for a really, really long time and see if we get to it, or we can test the genetics and know what we don't know, or know what we didn't know
mm,
before.
mm. And I think it's so important what you mentioned earlier, was that it's not only about performance, it's about health. And particularly for young athletes, yes, it's all about performance for them in that moment, and in that time period. But it's also really about making people understand and make them more aware that whatever we are doing in our youth obviously is going to impact how we age, and potential problems that we may be experiencing the older we get. And there's no it's not like we're saying, if you've already 50 and now it's too late to have a genetic test to understand your genetics, but it's really about making use of this genetic testing to understand, like you say, the why, in terms of certain things that we may be experiencing in our everyday life, but also in our exercise and activity, and even high performing athletes. So you've really opened up a really important topic today, Marina. So thank you so much for that. I think it's probably got a lot of people, a lot of our listeners thinking more about how hormones impact our injury resilience. And it may be worth us visiting this topic again, to explore some of the finer details of it. But I think it's you've definitely given a good summary and overview of how it impacts, particularly in those case studies that you brought for us today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Di. It was a pleasure. I just really want to stress that we never want to box anybody in, right?
Mm,
It's really about working with the genetics to see, yes, where are the vulnerabilities, but how do we optimize that so that our players can continue to perform at a high level for a really long time,
mm,
um, and even beyond their professional careers.
mm.
So to your point, of course, the genetics doesn't change, so it's going to be useful at any point in life. And we often hear from athletes like, I wish I had this information. I could have done things differently.
Mm.
And if you're young, you get the opportunity to do things differently now. And if you're a little bit older, well, there's still a lot that we can support long term. So
Excellent. Well, a perfect place to end off today. And thanks everyone for listening in. And please join us next time, when we will be speaking more about any topic that impacts our performance, but not only performance, our health and longevity as well. So thanks again, and see you next time.